I work to save forests such as this one. What you're about to see is a what-if story. What if we started treating our forests differently right now? What if we related to trees as individuals instead of as a commodity? How would we look back at such a huge change in culture 20 years from now? Perhaps like this. What you're about to see is what could be a newscast in the year 2041.
Like all revolutions, it had been growing slowly for years, but there was one specific day when we could all say that the plant kingdom rose her regal head. On that now famous date, March 21st, 2021, the Supreme Court of the United States voted that trees had rights and humans could be prosecuted for violating those rights. To some, this was unbelievable. Although the judicial officers were pilloried, they remained firm. They reminded the populace that there was a time when women had no rights and were considered property. There was a time when African slaves had no rights and were considered property. There was a time when domestic animals could be abused with no recourse. But those times, they said, were no more. The time when trees were considered personal property and could be killed with no regard for their priceless planetary service had come to an end. This new way of understanding the world was a great challenge. What about the many things that were still made of wood fiber? Regardless of our manufacturing advances, there were many items that could not be replaced by synthetics. Fine musical instruments were just one example. As in all cases, when the culture shifts, there were numerous adjustments and details to consider. Eventually, it was deemed acceptable to put trees to use for human good only if the trees were planted by humans on formerly unforested land. We needed to differentiate these crop trees from the wild trees. After a few years of protests and court cases, a new vocabulary was developed. Tree farms were places where trees were planted to be used for their fiber. Upon harvest, new trees would be planted in their place. Morally, this was not an ideal solution, but the harvested trees were shown honor and respect at harvest for the services they provided. In contrast to the tree farms were the wild forests. It was strictly illegal to harvest from a wild forest. These places were considered the lungs of the planet. Many people walked through the wild forests for the health benefits they got from breathing the living air. School locations and curricula were reorganized to ensure that all children spent a minimum of a day a week in a wild forest. The recently created Space Force was dissolved, and the federal funds directed toward that were used instead to pay for the new Forest Force. This branch of government paid for school restructuring, purchased wild forest lands, and prosecuted any entities found destroying wild forests. The Forest Force had a human telephone operators that would answer within 3 rings any time of the day or night. These operators were celebrated for their responsiveness and efficiency. Jobs in the Forest Force were sought after, and many people volunteered to work on the force without pay. Among its many other accomplishments, the Forest Force made sure that there was at least one protected, open to the public, accessible forest in every county that could biologically support forest growth. Visiting the local wild forest, such as this one, soon became an important way to socialize and restore one's spirit. Before the Revolution, even state parks were not protected in 42 out of the 50 states. After 2021, they were all preserved in their natural condition. Before the Revolution, owners of wild forest land had to pay yearly property taxes. After the Revolution, those who owned wild forests paid no property tax. Instead, taxes were doubled on the tree farmlands that were bringing in income. Across the globe, other nations were watching to see what this revolution would bring. It didn't take long before the scientists reported results of cleaner waterways, a resurgence of biodiversity, and a healthier populace. The UN, who had been monitoring the global loss of forests for half a century, called a special convention to discuss the new trend in tree rights. At that convention, it was pointed out that the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere had been holding steady for the first time since measurements began. Ecotourism to the wild forests of the United States was now a huge economic driver. Chartered flights and package tours from almost every nation on Earth brought additional income to every municipality near a wild forest. Those towns near the few never-logged old-growth forests were doing remarkably well. In the same way that the U.S. had been a leader in the national park movement, with other nations eventually following suit, the tree rights revolution has now spread across the globe. Despite the scientists' predictions that atmospheric carbon dioxide level reductions would be impossible in such a short amount of time, the levels did indeed start declining. Now, in 2041, as we celebrate the International Year of the Forest once again, it is difficult to imagine the reticence some felt toward tree rights in 2021. In hindsight, most of us wish we had made the change sooner.